Hi, everybody. I'm so happy that you're here with me today on this Friday afternoon. Today is the first of a series, a monthly series called FAFSA Friday, where we're going to talk about the changes that are coming with the new FAFSA, but we're going to break it down into 4 different sessions because there are a lot of changes. So to make them a little bit more digestible, we decided to do them over a series of months. I'm Mila Tappan, Manager of College Access and Outreach at FAME. And again, I want people to be sure that this is as engaging as possible, given that it's a webinar. So if you do have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat. I will stop periodically to address them. I want you to know we have some fun built in today. We have some polls. We're going to start off with one actually, and we have a game of Kahoot we're going to do at the end. So I don't know if any of you have ever played Kahoot, but we found it a great way to kind of reinforce what we're doing today and what we're talking about. We are recording the presentation, so it will be put on our website. We have a page, a FAFSA Simplification page, where all of our recordings are going, so you will find this one and others there, as well as additional resources. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Like I said, the first thing we are going to do is we're going to do a poll, because this will really help me. So the poll that we're going to start with is, did you attend either FAME summer training, which we did in August, or this week's Wednesday webinar, both or neither? And there's no wrong answer. This is really just me getting a way for me to get a sense of who has had what for trainings, so that I'm hopefully hitting the right balance as to what I talk about today. All right. Well, great. It looks like we have the majority of people who this might be one of the first trainings that you've been to with us, at least recently, related to the FAFSA. So I will share those results so you can see that over half, 63%, haven't been to one of our recent trainings. So that's exciting for me. I'm glad to have both people who haven't been talking about the FAFSA as much as we have, as well as people who have been. And what we're finding is that it does need to be repetitive. And you're going to notice this in today's presentation. How it's going to be structured is that the first half is we're going to kind of talk about things conceptually. And then the second half, we're going to be very specific about what needs to happen this fall to hopefully get students and families ready to file the FAFSA. And a lot of the information in part 2 is going to be the same information that was in part 1, just structured a little bit differently. So we're finding that for ourselves, we need to hear these things multiple times. So that is intentional, if you notice that today. So let's go ahead and start talking about what's going on with FAFSA simplification. So this FAFSA season is going to be very different than any we've experienced in the last several years. FAFSA simplification is going to represent the most significant changes to the FAFSA in the last 40 years. So really, in my lifetime, I've been working in financial aid for about 30 years, and we've certainly seen some changes, but this is even more significant than anything I have ever seen. And that is because the FAFSA process, the FAFSA form, and the FAFSA formula are all being updated. So basically, lots of stuff is changing. There are things that aren't, so don't panic. Not everything's changing, but there are lots of things that are changing. And I would say for the vast majority of things, they are for the better. Because of these changes, federal student aid said, you know what, we can't have this ready to go by October 1st. So back in March, they announced that it would be delayed until December. So the FAFSA will be coming out sometime in December. We don't know the exact date yet. They haven't released that. As soon as we know, we will let you know and put that information on our website. This is just a one-year thing. Next year, we'll go back to the FAFSA being available on October 1st. So why are there all of these changes? Well, actually, change is a result of 2 different pieces of legislation. And to be honest with you, there's a couple others that have also impacted this. But the 2 primary ones are something called the Future Act. And this was actually passed back in 2019. It was part of one of those big omnibus bills at the end of the year. And what it did is it said, basically, we need our departments at the federal level to talk to each other. So it basically expanded access for federal student aid to be able to get tax information directly from the IRS. And this is really important for two reasons. One is for FAFSA filing, but another reason that it's really important that a lot of students are experiencing, or former students who are borrowers, is that it is also how for federal student loan income-based repayment, they can get information directly from the IRS. So, it's just this thought that we need to make this part of the process easier. So again, that goes back to 2019. And then in 2020 is when the FAFSA Simplification Act was changed. And this is the act that the desire was to make the FAFSA easier, fewer questions, and expand Pell Grant eligibility. So that's what really was behind the FAFSA Simplification Act. Those two things are coming together. What you're going to find is that there are going to be times when you're going to say, I don't think this is simpler. And largely that is because of the information coming directly from the IRS. There's no middleman anymore. We're not, as parents, retrieving the information ourselves and sharing it. It is coming directly from the IRS. As a result, the security provisions, the privacy information, the strictness of all of this is really coming into play, making getting into the FAFSA a little bit more challenging than maybe it has been in the past, where it's really impacting our FSA IDs. So we're going to talk about that today because that's something we want to be sure that you're kind of prepared for and can share with your students and families. I'm going to go into more detail on all of this in just a moment. So the FAFSA simplification is being referred to as Better FAFSA, Better Future by Federal Student Aid. So that's kind of their tagline for this whole revamping of the FAFSA. And again, the goals are to have a streamlined and redesigned form that's been updated and is much more user-friendly. We have seen screenshots. It does indeed look to be much more user-friendly, less overwhelming. I think it's going to be really good for students and families. Reduce the number of questions, in large part because they're going to take information wherever it already exists and use it instead of having people enter information that they could get from other locations, like the IRS. Expanding eligibility and transparency specifically for Pell Grants. We're not going to talk a lot about that today. That's going to be in the October session, but also resulting in having a more secure and stable platform. My understanding is that the platform that they've been using dates back to like the 1960s, and it's not been working well the last few years. You see the circle, it times out, people have to start all over. So hopefully we're going to have a much better experience as a result of being on a new platform as well. So I thought it might be helpful to start with some terms. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of these terms, but then I'm going to use the terms and talk more about the terms as we go through today. So just, like I said, repetition is going to be really important here. So if you missed it the first time, don't worry. We're going to go over it again and again. So first of all, the EFC is going away. And so I think many people are happy about that. Instead, it's being replaced with the Student Aid Index. So we're going from an EFC to an SAI. Basically, this is just a name change. For financial aid offices, they will use the Student Aid Index the same way they use the EFC. But it is a name change that I think is welcomed because we know that the EFC confused families and wasn't usually a true representation of what the family was going to be expected to contribute. The next term that's a new term is contributors. So you're going to hear me say, you're going to wish you got $1 for every time I said contributor today. But contributor is a new term that's referring to anyone who's required to provide consent on the FAFSA. So possible contributors will include the student. The student is always going to be a contributor on the FAFSA and have to provide consent. And we're going to talk a lot about consent today. A parent might also be a contributor. The other parent might be a contributor, or a student spouse might be a contributor. So what a contributor is not, though, is a contributor is not meaning that someone has to provide financial support for a student. So I wish they hadn't maybe used this particular term because I'm afraid that some people will think that that means they have to provide financial support, but that's not what it means. It literally just means that they need to contribute information on the FAFSA and then provide consent and approval for the IRS to release their information. Another new term is the direct data exchange. So the direct data exchange is going to replace the IRS DRT, or data retrieval tool. So instead of the IRS data retrieval tool, which didn't work super well all the time because everything had to match up, so that's completely gone. It is literally going to be a direct exchange between the IRS and the Department of Education. So we'll talk more about this as well, but this being, just a straight shot back and forth is going to hopefully alleviate many steps in the process for individuals. Another term we're going to be using a lot today ongoingly is federal tax information. So federal tax information is the information that's going to come directly from the IRS. Federal tax information is going to be transferred into what they call an FTI module that is going to be attached to the FAFSA, but FTI information will not be visible. So what it will no longer be the case is we won't see a question about income and then see transferred from the IRS. Instead, the question just simply will not exist. That transfer of information will happen seamlessly once people provide consent and approval. It will live in the FAFSA, the FTI module, which is where eligibility will be calculated and the result will be transferred back into the FAFSA. So this is really a new way of things being done, but don't be concerned if you're not seeing any of this tax information on the FAFSA, and it will also not be on the FAFSA submission summary, which is what is replacing the student aid report. And that's on the next slide, we're going to talk a little bit about that. When we talk about federal tax information, I want to be sure to share with you the fact that it's not just income, it's taxes, it's potentially other fields on a tax return. It also includes a calculation for determination of family size, and it includes whether or not people even file taxes. So federal tax information is more than just income and taxes paid. It is basically other types of information that the IRS also has, and we'll talk about why that other information is critical as well as we go forward. And then consent and approval. So consent and approval is a term, again, we're going to use it a lot. Every contributor to the FAFSA has to provide consent and approval to use their information to match with the IRS. And it allows the IRS to disclose this federal tax information, or this FTI, back to the Department of Education and to use it in the FTI module, and then to redisclose that FTI to the colleges that are listed on the FAFSA and other organizations like us at FAME, okay? So consent and approval is a really big deal, and we're going to talk about it more in a moment. And then last but not least on this particular slide is the FAFSA submission summary, the FSS. So as I mentioned a moment ago, this is going to replace the student aid report. So the student aid report is being renamed. So no more SARS. Instead, we're going to have this FAFSA submission summary, or the FSS, which, it's a better name in the sense that it reflects what it actually is. Okay, so those are some new terms. So let's talk a little bit more about how those terms are going to be put into use. I'm not seeing any questions yet in the chat, but go ahead as you have them, and I will stop periodically and address them. So a big change to the FAFSA is the fact that it's going to become a roles-based form. So in the past, a student started a FAFSA, they did their section, and then that moved into the parent information if we're talking about dependent students. And that is really my focus today, is going to be on dependent students and how it's going to work for them. So now this roles-based form will mean that students will log in with their FSA ID, which guess what we're going to talk about, and they will only see their questions related to them, demographic information, where they went to high school, where they want their FAFSA information sent, and income and asset information, depending on exactly what they have to provide. The parents will log into their section of the FAFSA, and they will only see questions that are related to the parent. So for example, they'll provide demographic information, they will provide their income and asset information, again, depending on what's required, and that will pretty much be it for parents. Now, whoever starts the FAFSA needs to invite the other party, and that's because otherwise we'd have two separate modules that need to be connected together, okay? So the invitation is critical because that's how the FAFSA gets tied, the two pieces of the FAFSA get tied together. So either the student can start the FAFSA, in the case of a dependent student, and invite their parents, or the parents can start the FAFSA and invite the student to complete their section of the FAFSA. So when an individual, again, starts the FAFSA and invites contributors, there are some specific pieces of information that they have to provide. So let's just say, for example, the student decides to be the one that starts the FAFSA. They will start the FAFSA and they'll get to a point where they need to invite their contributors. They'll help them identify who those people are first, and then it will provide them an opportunity to provide information about their contributors. The pieces of information that will have to be provided are the contributor's legal name, date of birth, social security number, and email address. Now, here's the critical piece, is that the legal name, date of birth, and social security number need to match what was used to create an FSA ID, okay? So that information has to be exactly as it is on the FSA ID, which again is going to be the same as it is on the social security card. So that's really important because I know my kids don't know my social security number, okay? And without providing this information, the student cannot continue and invite their contributor. It's not like you can just skip providing social security number. It has to be provided. Now, email address does have to be included as well, but the email address doesn't have to be the one that was used on the contributor's FSA ID. So for example, if my son were to start his FAFSA, he wants to invite me. Maybe what I have is my Gmail account associated with my FSA ID, but he knows I check my work account more. He could use that email address instead, okay? So 4 pieces of information, 3 that have to match what is on the FSA ID exactly, with the exception being the email address. So I've got a quick question, and then we're going to do a poll. Yes, the question is, can they do an FSA ID before December? They can, and we're going to strongly recommend that. So hold tight, and we'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. All right, so let's do another poll. So this poll is going to be, get the old one gone, about inviting contributors. Okay, I hope everyone, doesn't seem like that it's launching. Sorry. Is it not launching? I don't know what's happening. Okay, well, hold on 1 second. Not launching. Nope, not launching. I am not sure why the poll is not launching. My first one launched beautifully. Okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We are going to skip it, but I'm going to tell you what it was, and so you will know what the question was. So if a student who starts the FAFSA can invite a parent contributor to complete the, a student who starts the FAFSA can invite a parent contributor to complete the FAFSA as long as they have the contributor's name, date of birth, and email address. Is that true or false? And just go ahead and drop it in the chat, and I'll check out the chat instead of doing the poll. I love that. Someone with an exclamation mark. False, right? Yes, exactly. You guys are paying really close attention. This is awesome. Okay. Not working quite as well as far as the poll thing, but your answers are absolutely right on target. So yes, that is false. What I left out of that question was social security number. And without the social security number, you are correct. They cannot move on. They can't invite a contributor. And we'll talk more about the invitation piece in additional sessions, but just so you know, what happens when they do invite a contributor is the email is sent immediately. And then the contributor can immediately start their section of the FAFSA. So if you're wondering, like, is there a lag in all of this? No, we could have a student sitting at the table, their parent sitting at the table with them. Let's say the student does start it, invites their contributor, the parent is going to get an email, almost instantaneously. So in case that's helpful to know that, we're still learning exactly how things are going to work. But Yeah, so I am getting a question about the Wednesday webinar. Yeah, this is very similar to the Wednesday webinar. This is a lot of the same information. We know it's repetitious, but at the same time, we thought that that would be helpful. That's why at the beginning, I did want to see how many people had attended the Wednesday webinar, and the vast majority had not. But for those of you who did attend the Wednesday webinar, yeah, you're going to find that a lot of this is the same thing. That being said, the Kahoot at the end is brand new. So if you want to hang in there, we'll do that. I do have a question. Are FSA IDs carrying over from previous years, or are students and parents creating new FSA IDs this year? No, they're carrying forward. So hold tight. We'll talk more about what we need them to do related to their FSA IDs, but they are carrying forward. So thank goodness we're not talking about a situation where people have to create brand new FSA IDs this year. Okay. Only people who don't have one will have to create one. All right, but first, let's talk a little bit about a new definition that's on the FAFSA. So a new definition is related to the parent on the FAFSA. So imagine a situation where parents are divorced or separated. In the past, you may have been familiar with the fact that the parent on the FAFSA would be the parent that the student lived with most during the last 12 months. That has changed and been tweaked. So starting with the 24-25 FAFSA, the parent who provides the greater portion of the student's financial support is going to be the parent responsible for completing the FAFSA. And so I've been having many conversations with people about this. School counselors have been calling and saying, how do we figure this out? Well, we're still waiting for some guidance from federal student aid, but I think that what we've heard so far in presentations that we've listened to is you really want to look at kind of everything. So think about, who does the student live with? Because let's be real, that whoever they live with that's paying rent, or who living with most of the time, that's paying rent or the mortgage, providing their food, electricity, water, all of that, that's providing financial support. Also think about health insurance. That's another big one. Which parent is providing the health insurance? Obviously, things like just money and clothing and, money for activities and things like that will all come into play as well. So, we're hoping to have a little bit more clarity on that. But I think at this point, just really sit down and think about, okay, when you total all of those things together, which parent is the one that's providing the majority of the student's financial support? Now, if that parent is married, as of the day they file the FAFSA, then the parent's information is required as well. Now, this is nothing new, but it often is a concern. I know that people sometimes are shocked when they go to fill out a FAFSA and they realize that someone that they married, last weekend now has to provide information on the FAFSA, even though the income that we're using for a FAFSA is years old. So for example, for the 24-25 FAFSA, it's going to be using income from 2022. But again, it doesn't matter if those people weren't married in 2022. It's, are you married as of the day you file the FAFSA? So again, not new, but something I think is always worth reiterating. Okay, now let's dive into FSA IDs. So FSA IDs are federal student aid IDs. So basically, everybody needs to set up a federal student aid account. And when people set up a federal student aid account, they create a username and password. And that username and password is what is required to access all of the federal student aid websites, including the FAFSA. Everybody has to have, that needs to get into a FAFSA, is going to have an FSA ID. Now, an individual can only have one FSA ID because it's tied to our social security numbers. So we're going to have a mix of people out there who already have an FSA ID. We do have some things we'd like them to do, but they already have one. They're not going to create a new one. And then we have people who have never created an FSA ID who are going to need to. No longer is there going to be the opportunity for a parent to start a FAFSA, for example, on behalf of a student using the student's demographic information. So up until the 24-25 FAFSA, if I wanted to start a FAFSA for my kiddo, but let's say I didn't have his FSA ID information, I could put in his name, social security number, date of birth, and I could start a FAFSA. That is not going to be the case. That option is gone. Now, when you are thinking about FSA IDs and parents specifically, you might wonder who needs an FSA ID. So if it's a scenario where families, the parents are married and file a joint tax return, then only one parent is going to need to have an FSA ID. So in my household, sorry to keep using it as an example, but just I think hopefully makes it a little bit easier. if my husband and I are married to each other and we do file a joint tax return, so only one of us needs to have an FSA ID. That's how it's been, right? So one parent needed an FSA ID if parents were married. What's changing going forward is that when parents are married but file separate tax returns, then both parents are going to now need their own FSA ID. Okay, that's new, that's different. If parents are not married, but they're living in the same household, both parents will need an FSA ID. That's how that's been. What we're going to find this year is we're going to get really personal really quickly with people. So not only are we going to say to parents, what's your marital status? But we're then going to follow that up with what type of tax return did you file? Because who needs an FSA ID is tied directly to who filed taxes and whether or not they were filed jointly or separately. This gets back to the IRS, I don't want to call it the retrieval, the IRS direct data transfer, okay? When you're providing consent, which is one of the things you're going to do, you can only provide consent on behalf of yourself. Now, if you file a joint tax return, you can provide consent on behalf of your partner that you filed your tax return with. But what I cannot do is I cannot provide consent and approval if my husband filed a separate tax return. Only he can do that. So that is why we're very quickly going to get to the question of what type of tax return did you file? If it's joint, either parent can provide consent and approval, which means only one needs to have an FSA ID to get into the FAFSA. But if they filed separately, both parents are going to have their own FSA IDs so they can get into the FAFSA, and they can each provide consent and approval. Okay, so that is definitely different than was in the past. So, and this is what we're referring to as contributors. Okay, so when we talk about who needs to provide consent and who needs to have an FSA ID, that is who is a contributor. So in some cases, both parents will be contributors. Imagine that scenario where parents are married, but they file separate tax returns. Both parents are going to be contributors. In the case of a married couple that file a joint tax return, technically only one parent is a contributor. Okay. Now you can list both of them on there, but only one has to be. All right. So a couple of other changes related to the FSA ID is the FSA ID is matched to the Social Security Administration information. And that's always been the case, but now it's going to need to be matched, and that match is going to have to come back before the FSA ID can be used. And that takes up to a week. So we usually see 2 to 3 days, but we're saying plan for a week ahead of time. So what this means, you know how we've always done these sessions where people come, maybe they've done nothing with their FAFSA at all. They haven't created FSA IDs. They could come to a session. They could create their FSA IDs. They could use them immediately to file the FAFSA. That is not going to be the case any longer. So we're going to talk about the fact that we do want people to get them ahead of time. Because if they come to a session, whether it's yours or ours, and they haven't done anything, the only thing they're going to be able to do that night is to set up their FSA IDs. You're going to have to wait for those to be matched before they can do the FAFSA. Okay. Now, another slight change is that every time an FSA ID is used, two-step verification will be required. They have been rolling this out, meaning the federal student aid. They've been rolling this out gradually. So last year we saw that new students had to do two-step verification. Throughout the year, we saw that all students then had to do two-step verification. But as a parent, I never had to, but I will have to going forward. Everyone, every time they use their FSA ID, is going to be required to provide that code. The two-step verification process basically generates a code that gets sent to an email or gets sent to a cell phone. A text is texted to a phone number, and that has to be provided in order to get into the FAFSA. Okay, so that's going to happen every single time. So I, for example, can no longer do my kids' FAFSA, even if I have their FSA ID information, unless I coordinating making sure that I can get the code from them. Okay, so if he's at work and I can't reach him, I can't do anything with his FAFSA. All right, individuals without a social security number are going to be able to create an FSA ID. They have not been able to in the past. The scenario in the past is that they would instead print off a signature page and sign it, and then send that signature page in. The signature page is going to be gone. There will be no signature page option. Instead, individuals will have to have an FSA ID. So more to come on this. Federal Student Aid has released a little bit of information. We know that they're going to verify identities using TransUnion instead of Social Security, but we know that there's a lot more details to come. So like with the date of the release of the FAFSA, once we know more, we will share more as well. So the direct data exchange. As we talked about in the very beginning, when we were talking about terms, the direct data exchange is going to be a direct exchange between the IRS and the Department of Education. This information, when the IRS releases it, will be sent to the FTI module, the Federal Tax Information Module, which will live right beside the FAFSA. I'm trying to visualize this. Will live right beside the FAFSA, will be connected with a student's FAFSA, but will not show. The information will not show in the FAFSA. Okay, so it's going to be sent to this module. Things will be calculated there, but you won't see that tax information on the FAFSA or on the FAFSA submission summary. Every contributor, so we kind of talked a little bit about contributors, will need to provide consent and approval to have their federal tax information imported and redisclosed. And I said the other day in the Wednesday webinar that I never know, should I talk about this first? Should I talk about contributors first? You know, the order and the sequence, but hey, that's why I'm just repeating it over and over so that hopefully these terms will become familiar as we talk about them more and more. So every contributor will need to provide consent and approval. That includes people who don't file taxes. So as I mentioned earlier, FTI or federal tax information is more than just income. It's more than just your income and your taxes paid. It's also literally, did you file taxes? So that is a piece of FTI. So absolutely everyone has to provide consent and approval. It is not a case where only tax filers have to. Everybody has to do that. And I've got a couple questions here, so hold tight just a second. So again, what's going to happen is the filer is going to approve this. So the contributor, let's just say it's a case of a married joint filing couple, only one parent will have to consent and approve. The FTI will be sent to the FTI module, and it won't be visible, but it will be calculated, and the results will be sent into the FAFSA. Okay, so let me check out the questions here really quickly. Oh, you're great, Bonnie. Yes. So Bonnie asked the question, if this will eliminate the need to provide non-tax filer documentation. That is absolutely the hope, is that, yes, this is going to verify that. So those non-tax filer statements that people have had to get over the past years that were kind of a nightmare, that should theoretically be all gone. So that's great. Just one second while I read this question. It's a little bit longer. Okay, so this question has to do with tax returns. And so let's just say we have a situation where someone gets remarried, but 2 years ago in 2022, depending on when they're doing the FAFSA, but 2022 tax year is what we're going to use for this year. They filed a joint return with their ex-spouse. In that situation, the people who are going to be contributors, okay, are going to be the parent who provides the most financial support and their spouse, because you've indicated that they're remarried, okay? Now, there is going to be a little bit of a hiccup because they filed a joint tax return with someone else. So I'm going to talk in a moment that there are going to be some exceptions to people providing tax information, and I'm going to address that more thoroughly there. Okay, so hold tight. I think it's the next slide. I'm going to talk about that. Great question. So the reason why consent and approval are such a big deal is because if consent and approval are not provided, the student is going to be ineligible for federal student aid. So if a parent says, you know what, I'm happy to provide my information, but I'm going to provide it. I don't want the IRS providing it to the Department of Education. If they don't provide that consent and approval, their student's ineligible for federal student aid, even if their income information is provided. So we've got to really, make sure that people understand that this is black and white. This is, you don't do this, you don't get aid. So this is an important thing I think we'll be talking about quite a bit going forward. as we just talked about, when the IRS data is accessed, it will also verify the non-filing status. So that's super. I think that's one of the great changes that's existing. And most people are going to find that their income questions are going to be answered by the DDX, going to be provided by the direct data exchange. Again, they won't even see those questions on the FAFSA at all. Now, there are some exceptions, okay? And those exceptions would be, for example, is imagine someone has been subject to identity theft. When they do their consent and approval, what's going to happen is the IRS is going to return information into the module that is going to say, hey, this individual did file taxes, but their identity has been compromised, so we can't release this information. Now, I can't quite see everything I want to see yet, but our understanding of what will happen is then within the FAFSA, because all this is going to happen in real time and everything updates miraculously, what we're going to see is then a pathway is going to open up, and those people will provide their information manually, their tax information manually, okay? Because the IRS cannot provide it. Imagine a scenario where someone says, I provide consent and approval, but I have an extension, so I haven't filed my taxes yet. What will happen in that case, guess what? Is that it will keep checking for that information to come in later. So that's really cool. Imagine it's a situation where people say, they are foreign tax filers, right? So the IRS, again, doesn't have tax information on them. Then what it will do is it will say, did you file a foreign tax return? And if the answer is yes, guess what? That manual pathway is going to open up, and they are going to provide their own information. The same thing is going to happen, as we understand it, for people who have remarried and their 22 taxes were filed with somebody else. So they cannot retrieve accurate tax information for 22 for those specific contributors. In that scenario, a couple of questions will be asked that will open up a pathway, and they will provide that information manually. So this is what we're understanding, not having seen it work exactly, but I feel really confident that it's going to work really well. The demos that we've seen, I'm encouraged. I'm really encouraged that this is going to be a relatively smooth and easy process for individuals. So I'm getting a question about if someone is being audited by the IRS. I don't know the answer to that question. So I will watch for that and see if the next time we have a session, if I've learned the answer to that question, and would be happy to share it if I have. Okay, and most untaxed questions are gone. So you might recall from the current FAFSA, the one we've been doing for years, that what happens is when we would provide our tax information, either through the IRS DRT or enter it manually, then we'd see a couple of other screens, one of which is where people would provide their untaxed income information. The most common was, it would ask the question about, did people contribute to a retirement plan pre-tax? And so if you did, you had to put in the amount that you contributed in that particular tax year. That question is gone. So two things: the question's gone, so it's making it easier, in meaning that there's just fewer questions to answer. But secondly, that is something that families are going to benefit from. So those families who have been contributing to retirement plans pre-tax, that was impacting financial aid eligibility, that will no longer be asked. And so because it's no longer asked on the FAFSA, it no longer is a piece of the formula and going to impact financial aid eligibility. So that's going to be a win, I think, for families who are doing that. All right. Next up is a poll, but I'm going to skip it because I'm going to assume that one's probably not going to work either. And we are doing well on time, but I want to make sure that we have time to do our Kahoot at the end. So we're going to skip the poll. We'll probably get to a similar question in Kahoot anyway. All right. So now I'm going to repeat myself, but intentionally, about what we want to be doing this fall based on kind of what the changes are related to the FAFSA. So we want to help students identify contributors. So again, if parents are married and file a joint tax return, information for both is required, but one parent can provide consent and approval because that one parent, because of the joint tax return, can do it on behalf of both parents, okay? So one parent when parents are married and they file a joint tax return. If they're married and file taxes separately, or if they don't, they're not married and they don't live together, or if they live together, not married, then both parents are going to be contributors and need their own FSA ID. So helping students know who those people will be, because they could be different than it was several years ago. Again, if parents are divorced or separated or never married and don't live in the same household, the parent who provides the most financial support is going to be the parent on the FAFSA. So again, that could be slightly different. If we're working with new students, they'll never know how it used to be. But for students who are currently in college, it could mean that a different parent is going to need to provide information on the FAFSA this year. Again, if the parent is remarried, on the day the FAFSA is filed, then their spouse will also need their own FSA ID unless they filed a joint tax return in 22. So people who have been remarried for a while, they probably file joint tax returns. Only one parent will need an FSA ID and need to provide consent. However, if that parent recently remarried and was not married in 22 to that person, then they both will need their own FSA ID and they will both need to provide consent. We want all contributors to create an FSA ID. So for those people who don't have an FSA ID, they should create an account early. We're saying at least a week before they're planning to file the FAFSA. They could do it today. So I would say as soon as possible, let's just get them done. Let's get that checked off the to-do list. In order to create an FSA ID, nothing has changed here. You will go to studentaid.gov and create that. Now, a few underlying things have changed, though, and one of those is that everyone is going to need a unique email address so that they can have that be verified. Now, what happened last year, for example, is people needed either a cell phone number or an email address. They did have to be unique, but either one could get them through the process. So if you could verify and do two-step verification with your cell phone number, that was good enough. And for a matter of fact, we were having issues last year at some of our events with the verification code coming through an email. So I know we have people out there that only have a verified cell phone number attached to their FSA ID. They don't have a unique email address. So I'm going to touch on that in a moment. But just remember that everyone is going to need to have an email address and it's going to need to be unique. So that means that if we have parents that maybe share an email address and both of them need an FSA ID, they're going to need to create another email account for that other parent so they can each have their own email address. And again, this is not changing, but we don't want students to use their high school email address. We want them to create a new email address, Gmail, Yahoo, Hotmail, whatever it might be, because we want them to have an email address that they're going to have access to while in high school, after high school, while in college, and after college, one that goes with them, because when they leave high school, they're going to lose access to their email, their high school email address. So very important that they do that. We still do want people to provide a cell phone number or mobile phone number and verify that. That's still a really good thing, still highly recommended, but that's optional. But an email address is no longer optional, which gets to the people who do have FSA IDs. So if we have contributors that already have an FSA ID, what we'd like them to do this fall is to log into their account at studentaid.gov and make sure that they know their username and password and can get into their FSA ID. So we want them to be able to log in and make sure that everything looks good and accurate. If they haven't, if they can't get in, then we want them to go through the process of retrieving their username and resetting their password or doing whatever they need to do. And if they have trouble with that, we can help with that. So anyone that's having challenges and just can't get that resolved, send them our way and we can assist with that. Additionally, we want people to log in because if they are one of those individuals that did not have an email address, they're going to need to add that email address and verify it before they can do a FAFSA. So again, that would be great if they get this done this fall. It's simple to log in and just add an email address and get it verified. You can do it immediately, but that does need to happen. Those people are not going to be able to use their FSA ID if they don't have a verified email address. And so if they need to update that or anything else, once they log in, they just go in under settings and they can make all of those updates. And what you're going to see is that this is the Federal Student Aid homepage. I do think that probably when they roll the new FAFSA out, it's going to look a little bit different, but I think it will be the same general information. So always, I have no doubt this will be here. This is where they're going to create an account if they haven't already, or this is where they're going to log in if they already have one. Okay, so that's right on the homepage. The other thing I want to point out on the homepage is they've made the FAFSA one of the buttons right at the very top. So that's excellent. And that's going to make filing the FAFSA a lot easier. You're going to notice that instead of sending people to FAFSA.gov, which is technically a redirect, our materials are now going to say we're just sending everyone to studentaid.gov because they can log in and they can do their FAFSA right here. It used to be harder to find the FAFSA link, but they've made it nice and easy. And then some other things that we need people to do is to start talking about who will start the FAFSA. As we talked about, when people invite the other person, they need to provide certain types of information, and that those pieces of information are not something that are always available to everyone all the time or known. So people want to have that conversation because they need to get those two pieces connected. So that piece is going to be critical. And again, they have to provide the legal name, date of birth, social security number as it exists on the FSA ID, and they need to provide an email address, which can be different. And then the last thing before we play Kahoot is we want them to be sure that we want to be sure we're conveying the importance of consent and approval, and just reiterating whenever we can that people have to do that, because if they don't provide consent and approval, their student will not be eligible for any federal aid. And again, this includes non-tax filers, those who have filed for an extension, those who file a foreign tax return, those who are under audit. We know at a minimum, we know they always have to provide consent and approval, okay? Always. If they didn't provide consent and approval originally, because they didn't understand how important it was, and they went ahead and submitted the FAFSA without doing that, they can go back in and update the FAFSA. Now, with what we've seen, it is very clear that they have to provide consent and approval, and they are asked to do so multiple times if they don't do it the first time. So, it should be clear. I don't think this is something you could easily miss. They are making it, abundantly clear that this is a requirement. Okay. So with that, hold on. I've got a couple questions. Let me just check them really quickly. Okay. So do 529's contributions to count as support for a student for the purposes of figuring out who provides the greater amount of support as potential parent on the FAFSA? Great question. It depends. For the student that's probably starting college, no, because what we're looking at is who provided the most financial support in the last 12 months. But as the student goes through school, and if the parent is using the 529 to help support the student, maybe their rent and things like that, that could come into play. But that first year, because we're looking at the last 12 months, the most recent 12 months, then that would be different. A question about, wouldn't the IRS report pre-tax retirement contributions? No, they're not on the tax return. So my contributions to my retirement plan are not on my tax return, which is why we've always had to provide them separately. So those are not that information is not coming back. There is a type of pre-tax, there is a type of retirement piece on the tax return. I'm not going to go into it today, but just the standard situation where people contribute pre-tax. Nope, not on the tax return, not with the IRS providing it, and not on the FAFSA at all. Okay, so let me stop this screen share and let me go over and grab Kahoot. Okay, got it all up and open, so hopefully it'll be quick. Hopefully it'll be quick. Okay, all right, now I'm going to share my screen again so you can see Kahoot. All righty. Okay. Can someone tell me if they are seeing Kahoot? Just want to make sure. Oh, yes. Okay. Excellent. Thank you, Randy. Okay. So what we are going to do is we are going to play Kahoot. And I don't know if you have ever played Kahoot before, but if you haven't, I think you're going to like it. I hope you're going to like it. We've been playing it a lot lately. So it's just basically a game, but it's fun. It's meant to, kind of make learning all of this new stuff more enjoyable. If it's of interest, last night I made my husband and my son play Kahoot. This particular Kahoot that we're going to do, they did as well. All right, little slow loading, so hold on, it's coming, it's coming. What you're going to do is you are going to go to www.kahoot.it, and in a moment that's going to come up here, and I don't know why it's taking so long. Come on, there we go. Okay, so again, you are going to go to www.kahoot.it, and when you do that, you are going to be asked for your PIN, and here it is. It's 1383338. So go ahead, put in your PIN. You're going to give yourself a nickname, and I'm going to give everyone a minute to do that. And then we're going to play. And so what Kahoot is, if you haven't done it before, is it's going to ask a series of questions. We'll do one at a time, and then we'll talk a little bit about them. And they are either going to be true, false, or there's going to be 4 choices. So one thing I want you to know is that it's also timed. So not only will it rank people, although this is not about winning, but I know some of you are very into winning. What it's going to do is it's going to rank people based on getting the right answer, but also people who got the right answer as quick as possible. So just keep in mind that is also a piece of it. Okay, so let's see. I am not seeing new people continuing to be added, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So there are 10 questions. About half are true and false. About half are, going to be 4 questions. When you have 20 seconds for the questions and 10 seconds for the true and false. So what does SAI stand for? Does SAI stand for Student is Always Independent, Student Aid Index, Student Asset Inventory, or Student Asset Index? What is the correct answer? 3, 2, 1. Let's see what you all said. Student Aid Index. So the vast majority of you got that right. So that's awesome. Student Aid Index is the SAI, and that is replacing the EFC. All right. So you can see after every one, we're going to see the scoreboard. Okay. So next one's true or false. 10 seconds on this one. True or false, the student aid report will now be known as the FAFSA submission summary. That is true. It is going to be the FAFSA submission summary, the FSS. All right, let's take a look at our leaderboard. We've got some changes here. All right, let's move on to the next question. Another true and false. A parent can access the student section of the FAFSA using the student's demographic information. True or false? And the answer is false. That is correct. There will be no way to access any parts of the FAFSA for anybody without an FSA ID. All righty. Okay, I don't know who Spiller Guts is, but hey, you're killing it. So let's keep going. 4th question. If a dependent student's parents are married to each other, but filed 2022 taxes separately, who needs an FSA ID? And I apologize, there's a typo in that. Should not be a period. Student and 1 parent, student only, student and both parents, or just the parents. Okay, the key piece here, file 2022 taxes separately. Correct. The student and both parents, and that's because the student always needs an FSA ID. In this case, because parents filed their taxes separately, they both have to provide consent, meaning they both have to have an FSA ID of their own. All right, Spiller Guts is still doing awesome. You're gonna have to text me separately and let me know who you are if you continue on a streak like this, because I might have a job for you if you're not already employed here at FAME. Okay, when should students create an FSA ID? Students don't need an FSA ID. At least a week before they plan to file the FAFSA, at least a month before they plan to file the FAFSA, or just prior to starting the FAFSA. When should students create an FSA ID? The answer is, we're saying a week before they plan to file. They might be able to cut it to 3 or 4 days, but let's always, let's say a week and make sure they have plenty of time. But no longer can they do it just before they start the FAFSA. They are going to have to wait. Oh, we have a change at the top of the board. Okay. This is our 6 of 10 questions. Who is always a contributor? The person helping the student pay for college, a third-party entity helping the family with the FAFSA, the student's parents, anyone required to provide consent for FTI exchange on the FAFSA. I only have so much space, so I didn't say consent and approval, but that technically is what it is. Very good. Excellent. It is anyone required to provide consent and approval for the FTI exchange on the FAFSA. All right, let's see what the leaderboard does. All righty. Let's go to the next one. When parents are divorced, which parent is the parent on the FAFSA? Is it going to be the parent who the student lived with most the last 12 months, the parent who provided the most financial support the last 12 months, the parent who is willing to file the FAFSA, or both biological parents, even if the student's parents are divorced? And the answer is the parent who provided the most financial support the last 12 months. You guys are killing it. You guys are doing a great job. So you can see that at the leaderboard, as things change up a little bit, it's not that people aren't getting the right answers, it's how quickly you're doing that. And I know that causes stress, but this is fun stress, right? All right, 8th question. If a student starts the FAFSA and invites a contributor, what information doesn't need to match the FSA ID exactly? Which one doesn't? The legal name, the date of birth, the social security number, or the email address? Which one does not need to match the FSA ID information exactly? And the answer is the email address, okay? So the email address can be something different than on the FSA ID. Now, the legal name does have to be exact. So this is going to be problematic for some students and parents. A lot of people go by a nickname. And so in the case of going by a nickname, they need to use the legal name when they're going through this process, both when they create their FSA ID and when they invite a contributor to their FSA ID. All right, Heather is up 4 places. She's our highest climber. Question number 9 is a true or false. Parents who don't file taxes don't have to provide consent and approval. True or false? And the answer is false. Everybody got that one correct. That's awesome, right? Everybody's got to provide consent and approval regardless of whether or not you filed taxes or not. All right, this is the last one, everybody, for today. But this, I hope, is making you want to come back for the next time. True or false? If parents don't consent, income info can be entered manually and students will be eligible for federal financial aid. Is that true or false? If they don't consent, but they do provide information manually. Are you fooled by the graphic? No, not most of you. Okay, no, if parents don't consent, the student's not eligible, even if they provide income information manually. Okay, let's see who the winner is. Spiller Guts, number 2. And number 1, I don't know who you are, but if you want to tell me who you are, I would love that. You can identify yourself in the chat if you choose to. So this is fabulous. We are at 1:59. I'm going to try to share my screen real quickly again, just because I want to show you where we're at. A few last pieces before I let you go, because I know you probably, many of you have 2 o'clock meetings. I will also look at the questions very quickly. Okay, so I want you to know we're having events. So we're having fall events for students and parents with the idea that we'll provide an abbreviated financial aid overview, but we will create FSA IDs. That is the intention of our events in the fall, is to take the second half of that hour and actually create email addresses and FSA IDs. So we have a whole bunch, you guys. We are offering over 60 of these sessions this fall. So please go check out the events and share them with students and families. And then the FAFSA Fridays, training for partners. We're going to continue this. We're going to do an episode in October, November, December. I hope you had fun today. I hope you found it helpful. We'll talk about different things next time. I would love to have you go and register for any upcoming events that are of interest to you. And please do check out our FAME website. We've got lots of great information there. And we have a FAFSA simplification page specifically that has all sorts of resources. Just go to famemaine.com/FAFSA simplification. And there you will see all of our recordings and all sorts of different resources. Okay, I know who the winner was, and I'm going to call you out because you're awesome. So Randy Payne, who she and I met years ago when I worked in the financial aid office, Orono, and she was a student. So I am so proud of all of you. This was great. I hope to see you again. I'm enjoying reading your comments. So yes, I look forward to seeing y'all again. Okay, have a wonderful Friday. Stay safe, everyone. It looks like the weather's not quite as bad as we thought it was going to be, but a little bit tough. So be safe. Okay, I look forward to seeing y'all soon. Take good care.